crazy. I love that I'm so short that I can't actually use those mics. So, ready? All right, let's do this. Should I give it like 2 more minutes maybe? I'll give it 2 minutes. Yeah. 1 minute, yeah. Thanks, Helena. Thanks, Hal. I know. Hello? Hello. Okay. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to A History of Ciphers. During these 3 days at EthCC, you're going to see over 100 technical talks and workshops. So rather than talk to you about the latest and greatest blockchain dev tools, I want to do something a little bit lighter and perhaps a bit more esoteric, and talk to you today about some really, really old encryption tools. So I hope to be able to take you back in time to the origins of the technology that served as the foundation and catalyst for the current blockchain industry. So that being said, when you talk to protocol researchers about crypto, they don't usually think of this as a reference to cryptocurrency, but rather as a reference to cryptography. So in the grand scheme of things, modern cryptography hasn't really been around for that long. And there was an essay published in 1945 by Claude Shannon of Bell Labs called A Mathematical Theory of Cryptography. And this is widely considered to be the starting point for modern cryptography. So what happened before then? From the beginning of recorded history, codes and ciphers have been used to carry secret messages. So today, we'll explore some of the most significant early encryption methods, such as the Caesar shift cipher, Skytail, Trimetheus' Tableau, and the Visionnaire cipher. So as you can imagine, the race to create even more complex code and this parallel race to break them continues today as computers strive to create unbreakable codes that are encryptions of sensitive data. But actually, before there were computers involved, it was actually people who were trying to find novel ways of encrypting information manually. So let's go back to the beginning. Codes and ciphers. In the modern world, we are constantly surrounded by different forms of encryptions in our daily lives. So anytime that we make a phone call, send an email, get money from an ATM, buy something online, we're really relying on invisible, sophisticated forms of computer encryption to protect our data and keep it private. However, the desire for secrecy and privacy is nothing new. So for more than 2,000 years, ciphers and codes have played vital roles in politics, the theater of war, the fight against crime, the search for freedom in all of its forms, and many, many love affairs. So in fact, wars have been won and lost, empires have built or destroyed, and individual lives have been transformed by messages passing through in secret. So with so much at stake, it comes as no surprise that there's a never-ending battle between cryptographers and code breakers. Nothing captivates the human mind quite like secrets. And for some code breakers, the challenge to unravel them is often motivation enough. But there can be many other motivators, such as idealism, patriotism, revenge, money, or a desire for greater knowledge. So we can start with a quick some few definitions about the differences between codes and ciphers. This is a bit of an oversimplification, but essentially, ciphers are systems for concealing the meaning of messages by replacing them with other symbols. So you replace an A with a letter D, B maybe with a letter X, and you go on and you create a message that is enciphered. On the other hand, codes place more emphasis on meanings rather than characters, so they tend to replace whole words or phrases, and typically they refer to a pre-established codebook. So it makes it a little bit more challenging because you need to have that reference in order to be able to refer to the code and understand what those symbols translate into. So in practice, many cipher systems are actually hybrids of both cipher and codes, and that's sort of what adds layers of complexity to the encipherment and encryption. Another difference between the codes and ciphers relates to their level of inherent flexibility. So codes are static because you have a code book and you have a certain, I don't know if you've seen this in the movies, on television, there's always some reference, a little black book or a New York tourism book that people refer to, and now that's how they translate the messages. But even if there's multiple potential meanings for a word, it really comes down to a limitation in the number of variables that a code can have. Whereas a cipher has inherently more flexibility because it's able to transpose and add layers of complexity into how it creates that encipherment. So one of the main ways in which cryptanalysts break codes is actually by identifying repetition and patterns. I'm going to show that to you a little bit later. But ciphers then add a lot of extra layers in order to try and counter that. So at the end of the day, there's a lot of different ways in which you can alter the algorithm in order to add complexity to the cipher. So back to the origins. The history of secret write-in and hidden messages stretches back to some of the world's most ancient civilizations. The roots of cryptography can actually be traced back to ancient Egypt, where scribes carving stories onto the rocks became to alter the hieroglyphics that they were carving. So even though this was not necessarily done to conceal a meaning, it did serve to foreshadow the cryptography that was going to be developed later on. And one of the earliest techniques of concealing information was actually discovered in Mesopotamia on a really, really small tablet on the banks of the Tigris River. And it dates back to 1500 BC. And it had an encrypted formula for making pottery glazes. So it was written in unusual groups of consonant vowels using something known as cuneiform signs. And it was simply done as a way for whoever had that to guard his, what he considered to be a valuable trade secret. And the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Greeks, they all developed their own ways of hiding the meaning of their messages. So the Greeks were pretty adept at hiding it under the wax of wax tablets, inside of items, tattooing them on people who were then the messengers. And perhaps as far back as the 17th century, the Spartans were well known for using a device known as a skytail to carry secret messages using a rudimentary kind of transposition cipher. So according to Greek historian Plutarch, the way that it worked was as follows. So whenever they would send out an admiral or a commander, they would make two round pieces of wood, exactly like one like the other in terms of their dimensions, in terms of length and general thickness. And they keep one and they give the other one to the envoy. So whenever they want to send an important message, they would take a long, long piece of parchment paper, wrap it around this piece of wood, and then start to write normally. And you get something along the lines of that, where the parchment itself doesn't actually enable you to read the message unless you know what to wrap it around. And then in the time of the Romans came the first major historical figure to be associated with the cryptographic method, which is Julius Caesar. So, there you go. So, Caesar is remembered as one of the most famous rulers of ancient Rome, and he was born in about 100 before Christ. In his military memoir, Gallic Wars, he described how he obscured the meaning of vital wartime messages in case they were ever intercepted. However, his predilection for secret writing was not so secret. So Greek historian Tranquillus recounted how if Caesar ever wanted to send anything confidential, he wrote it in a cipher. So the Caesar shift is actually a simple substitution cipher. It gets the name from the way that the cipher alphabet is formed. It's a monoalphabetic substitution cipher since each letter is replaced by only one letter, and the same one each time appears in the encrypted message. So that is to say, if you look at Tranquillus's explanation of the Caesar cipher, it really says must substitute the fourth letter of the alphabet, namely D for A, and so with the others. If you were writing a quick script to create an automatic decoder for the Caesar shift, all it would say is shift n+3, and that would automatically decode anything. And going back to substitution ciphers, the same principle applies for any variation of that, as long as you shift the letters further into the alphabet, going from 1 up to 25 spots, and the alphabet wraps around it. So that was the very, very first substitution cipher. The next evolution of ciphers turned into cipher disks. So this new form of cipher can actually be traced back to the papal court and was created by a Renaissance man known as Leon Battista Alberti. So when the Vatican reached out to him and explained that they had a need to send encrypted messages, he agreed to help, and he wrote an essay back then, which is their version of a white paper. But he wrote an essay in 1467 where he laid out the foundation for a completely new way of writing in cipher. So he described a system of encryption using two concentric metal disks whose circumferences were divided into 24 equal parts. The segments of the outer disk contained the letter of the alphabet and numbers 1 to 4. He left out 3 letters, and there was a couple of them that were not in the Latin alphabet. And then the cells of the inner circle contained the 24 letters of the Latin alphabet in a random order. And so in order to send an encrypted message, the letters or numbers in a plain text message were read on the outer plate, and then they were replaced with letters that were found in the inner plate. So both the sender and the receiver needed to have identical disks in order to be able to encipher and then decipher the message, and they needed to also agree on the initial position for the two disks to be relative to each other. So far, this is still just a monoalphabetic substitution. But then Alberti took this sort of ingenious step forward where he decided that after 3 or 4 words, he would actually change the position of the index by turning the circle, turning the dial. And so, and then he would also he would substitute certain phrases with numbers from a code book that he had, and then he'd merge it all together, and that's how you have this encryption. And so the reason that cipher disks came about was because the original forms of ciphers were a little too easy to crack, because you could look at frequency of letters appearing in messages and figure out what the formula was, because there's a pretty predictable way to the pattern in which letters appear in languages. So this cipher disk then was trying to add added variables of randomness and variability in order to further protect the messages. From there, we move on to Timotheus's Tableau. And he was a German-born abbot who wrote the world's first book on cryptography in 1518. It was a series of 6 books on codes and ciphers, and he titled it Polygraphia. So through his work, he set out what has now become the standard method for writing polyalphabetic cipher systems, which is known as the Tableau. And if you look at it here, the Tableau is actually all the letters of the alphabet written across. So it's 26 columns across and 26 rows down. And each row contains the alphabet in standard order, but every time it shifts over one place, similar to the Caesar shift. And so in order to write an encrypted message, the sender would use the first row to encrypt the first letter, the second row to encrypt the next one. So if you see here in this version of all is well, even though there's 2 L's next to each other, they're actually different letters because of how it goes down. And so this makes it a lot harder to break the code simply by looking at it and saying, oh, that must be the same letter. Over the next few decades of the 16th century, this went through a lot more of iterations. But someone who really stands out in connection to the Tableau cipher was a Frenchman called Blaise de Visionnaire. So the Visionnaire cipher, or the Chiffre de Visionnaire, is a development in polyalphabetic ciphers. He was a French diplomat who published a really important book in 1586 called Tract de Chiffres, which loosely translates into process ciphers. His book took another step forward in the development of polyalphabetic ciphers by suggesting a series of keys that could be used to decide which rows of the tableau to use when enciphering messages. So instead of cycling through the standard alphabet, the person sending the message would use them in a specific order and sequence which would follow the key. So if you start to see his methodology, it starts to resemble a little bit of what we do today. And if you think about how he added an extra key, what he meant was this version over here. This is what's known as essentially like a public key for enciphering and deciphering, because the intended recipient would know that you just simply work your way down through the alphabet. Whereas in this version, the key meant, for example, let's say the key could be cipher, right? And so you would start with looking at the first row that fell under C in order to encrypt the message, and then you'd move your way through in order to overlay the key on top of the actual encryption. So, all right. So following that, you have the black chambers. So the Visionnaire cipher is significantly harder to crack than the monoalphabetic cipher. However, polyalphabetic ciphers were slow to use and prone to inaccuracies, even though they were highly secure. So, but because of that, nomenclators really kept their place as the method of choice for hundreds of years, and people kept using the simpler versions of ciphers. And one of the most skilled cryptographers in history actually built his career around being able to construct really tricky nomenclators. Another Frenchman, his name was Antoine Rossignol, and born in 1699, and he actually became France's very first full-time cryptologist and was a central figure in the courts of King Louis XIII and King Louis XIV. So along with his son, who was also a cryptographer, they invented something known as the Great Cipher. And this was an enhanced monoalphabetic cipher that was particularly resistant to cracking. So the cipher performed substitutions in syllables rather than individual words, and used a series of hacks, including having a code group that meant ignore the previous code group. This Great Cipher was used to encode the king's secrets, but after both of those cryptographers died, the details of that system were lost. And it was such a great ciphering method that no one could break it for centuries. And so several centuries later, in 1890, a French cryptoanalyst spent 3 years of his life working on cracking the code and being able to finally recover the content of that correspondence for the royal archives. And that experience made it clear to the rulers of France that the interception of enciphered messages from rivals had a lot of value. And they created something called the Cabinet Noir, or the Black Chamber, which was a team of French codebreakers that was routinely intercepting and reading the dispatches of foreign diplomats from the 1700s onwards. So this institutionalized cryptanalysis became common practice across Europe in the 18th century. And the most famous was operating in Vienna and was known as the Geheime Kabinett-Kanzlei, which translates into the secret legal office. And this Vienna's Black Chamber was founded during the rule of Empress Maria Theresa and was renowned for its efficiency. Vienna was one of Europe's commercial and diplomatic crossroads during the 1700s, and the passing of mail through the city and post offices were every day, and there was large amounts of it coming through. So the Black Chamber really made use of this activity. And every bag of mail that was scheduled to go into each one of the local embassies was first brought into a secret room in the Black Chamber at about 7 in the morning. And then the staff essentially opened all the diplomatic letters, copied the important pieces, resealed the letters, and sent them on to their more normal morning delivery. Britain had its own form of institutionalized cryptanalysis. It was named the deciphering branch, and they were essentially sent intercepted letters by the secret office and the private office, which were the two spying divisions of the British Post Office. The routine letter opening started as a thing for diplomats, then it moved into something they did for foreign content, and then it eventually wasn't limited to messages from abroad. Politicians were soon finding out that their own correspondence locally was being monitored. So as early as 1735, members of parliament started complaining that their letters had clear evidence of having been opened at the post office and of tampering. So overall, the skilled work of the Black Chambers increased the pressure on cryptographers to use more complex ciphers. Soon the pressure would be magnified with the dawning of the era of electrical communication, which started with enciphered Morse code over telegraph and eventually led to the development of modern cryptography. So that's it. And I'm going to finish, finish by reminding you all that we have an EthCC after party on Thursday. That's it. Thank you.
Real quick, if there's if anybody's got any questions, by any chance, I can't ask it in French. So.
When the guy finally broke the really great cipher, was there anything like a treasure somewhere? Like this guy who spent 3 years of his life in 1890, did he find anything like cool?
So I mean, what he found a lot of respect from the local cryptographic community. He didn't find great treasure. The king wasn't writing about where he hid his gold, but yeah, I mean, I think code breakers is an entirely different subset of people who dive into this just predominantly for the thrill of solving these puzzles. So, yeah.
So, thank you very much. It's a pleasure. Yep. That was fantastic. Thank you very much.